Hello and welcome to a RackForms technical video. In this one we'll be talking about MSSQL and how we use it in more advanced jobs. So the first thing that of course should be pointed out is that most of the time we're going to be using PHP, Apache, and MySQL. Though RackForms is plenty happy to live on IIS and using MSSQL. And in fact that's what we're actually looking at right here. So I have IIS up and running. I have the web platform installer installed, and then from there you notice I can launch it right from IIS. I went ahead and just searched for PHP, and I installed PHP 5.1.4 and also the PHP manager for IIS. And when I do that, I can select the site, and I get this nice button here for PHP Manager. It allows me to go in and manage things about my PHP setup. So very easy to get PHP and IIS set up together. And then MSSQL, of course, its own installer that we have here, RackForms installed to MSSQL. So here it's tables and store procedures. So plenty happy to live together, just not as common. Now that said, one hint that I would give is that if we are planning on using IIS and MSSQL, or even just MSSQL, that you probably want to install RackForms to MSSQL straight away. In other words, if we know that we're never really going to need to talk to MySQL at all, or very rarely, I would stick with the database provider that you're going to use most for the install, which in this case would be MSSQL. And the reason why we do that is actually really simple. So when we install RackForms to, in this case, MSSQL, by default then, the database that we use is the database we've installed RackForms with. So for example, I can select my page right here. I can scroll down in my items and select a query module. And then you'll notice now, without having to set any connection properties, I can simply select the query to run right here, and I'll turn on data dump. And now, again, without having to set any query connection strings, we just query that MSSQL database instance. However, that doesn't mean that we're tied to that particular database. So if I ever need to talk to a different database, which could mean a completely different vendor, all I have to do is select my item that's talking to a database, and under data source right here, I would simply select the database vendor I want to use. In this case, I'll simply say MSSQL again, the host name, which for me is localhost, the database name, RackForms, the username, RackForms, and test. Make sure I get that right. And you'll notice now that the result is the exact same right here. I simply now overridden the default connection properties, which again is the database we've installed RackForms to. Now it should be pointed out, of course, that if I were to change anything about this to make it invalid, RackForms is going to give us error connection strings if we have data dump or error messages turned on. So in this case, I've broken our username, and notice now that MSSQL gives us an error string back. Finally, I should also point out that there is a subtle difference between the full version of SQL Server and the SQL Server Express. Specifically, one of the conventions that SQL Server Express will do is it'll install it as server/instance name. So in other words, matpc is what this full version of SQL Server Enterprise has done for us, and you can actually see that here in the SQL Server Management Studio application, right? Like my computer name here is matpc, and therefore my SQL Server instance name is matpc. And so if I put in matpc right here, as opposed to localhost, the query still works. However, again, SQL Server Express usually does it this way. It'll do computer name, and then actually it's SQL Express, right? So do something like that. So let's kind of keep an eye out for that. And of course, just generally speaking, the connection properties of SQL Server are sometimes the hardest thing to get right. It is a big install, it's a big package of software, and usually this will give us the most errors. Though again, it is important to note that, for example, because this instance doesn't exist right here, if I were to try to build this form, again, as long as I have my debugging options turned on for this database item right here, either error messages or data dump, this will actually give us an error message. So taking that knowledge then, and by the way, this is going to run for a second here because failed instance names always take a little bit longer to process. You can see here that error locating instance. So we're going to use now that as our backdrop for taking a look at a little real world work here, which is we want to create a login system, and then we want to tie that login system to form submissions. So the basic concept here then is the login part we don't actually have to worry about. So by default, RackForms ships with a job called login form, and that's under the full applications area. So you just crack open load example job, type in login for our filter, and we'll get that job loaded up. Now this, it should be said here, is the MySQL version. The MSSQL version, which I'm working on right here, is only going to be found in versions of RackForms after about the middle of November 2013. So if you have an earlier version of RackForms, you're going to want to go ahead and download the newest so that you can grab this sample job. We also have a video here on YouTube which covers this job in some detail, so I'm going to be very light talking about the details of the login system here. If you want to learn more about how this works, I would point you to this YouTube video here. We go into a lot of detail. For our case then, or for this video, I just would really like to quickly point out that the difference really between the two versions, the MSSQL and the MySQL versions, are that we simply use a different command to encrypt our passwords. So MySQL uses the AES encrypt and decrypt, whereas MSSQL uses encrypt by passphrase and decrypt by passphrase. Other than that, though, this video right here and therefore the jobs are essentially identical. Now, specifically to that point, one of the things that we want to do now is we want to take this login form job and we want to tie it to a form submission. So let's take a look at that real quick. So when I log into this form right here, you'll notice that I have a little query module. And its SQL right here is actually going to query my database, and it's going to see if the username and password I provided are valid. And if they are, if I scroll down a little bit right here, one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to create a session variable here that has our entry ID tied to it, right? So by default, when I log in, if we look at my login table right here, you notice that each one of these rows is going to have a unique identifier, which is this integer right here. So this ID column will always give each one of our users a unique value. We can use that unique value then to tie to our other database tables. So for example here, if I know that my username right here always has an ID of 1, I can actually say in this table right here, this login demo table, that when I submit a submission right here, I'm going to collect name, age, and also this user ID. User ID is going to equal the ID of this column right here. So we're going to tie those two guys together. So let's actually take a look at how that works in RackForms. So as I already said, we create a session variable right here called FB entry ID, and this is then going to hold the value of the ID column in the database. That is this guy right here, right? So now all we have to do to utilize that is to, in our second job, collect the database fields that we need, in this case name and age, but then also make sure that we have a third parameter for that user ID. So I'm going to say user ID, and I get a parameter placeholder for them right here, and then I'm just going to say, here is that session FB entry ID. So these two guys right here are collecting the form field name and the form field age. That is these two guys right here. And into user ID, that is this guy right here, I'm going to take the value that I got from the login form right here, right? So the session value of FB entry ID. So let's actually take a look and see if this works. So I'll take my form, I'll fill out my fields, and when I hit submit, go to my confirmation page. So far so good, and hopefully if I look at my database now, we'll see that I'm going to have a user ID of 1 in here. And indeed we do. So that is how we tie form submissions together. Now if I wanted to grab data back out of this then, there's a couple different ways that we could do that. We can use Builder to query, say, this table and grab all user ID equals 1 values, or I can just build a form field that would pre-populate using ID 1 right here as a dynamic variable. So that is a quick look then of how we use MSSQL in RackForms, and then also how we tie a login form submission together with a user submission right here. As a quick review then, if we go back to the login form MSSQL, remember that this job will be out for every user after the middle of November. And again, to find it, just type in login. It'll be called login form or login form-MSSQL. The job itself then, here, this login form handles all the nitty-gritty for us. The one thing that we care about, though, is on this submission page right here, when we scroll down, we're saving a session variable called FB entry ID. Now this is what essentially a session ID looks like as raw code in PHP. What's nice about RackForms, though, is we give an easier way of grabbing that out, which in this case is in the form of S for session these two brackets right here, and in the middle of that, the name of the session variable, which is FB underscore entry underscore ID. We, of course, use that in this SQL insert statement right here to say, when I submit this form, I want to put a value in name, age, and user ID. So name, age, user ID, and user ID, again, is coming from the session variable, which is going to be tagged appropriately with the correct user ID that we've created right here. And again, we do all of this for you. It's just up to you to tie these two rows together. So I'll leave it at that. Of course, this is a complicated topic, so if you have any questions, feel free to call or email at info@rackforms.com, and hope you enjoyed.